Thank you very much, Kathy. Douglas Aviles Bernal is the executive minister of the Evergreen region of American Baptist Churches. He's a Guatemalan immigrant who was ordained in 2010 just up the road in Norristown, actually. He lives out west now. He tells the story of a church that wanted to reach out to nearby neighbors of a different ethnic background. And I confess I don't remember all the details of the story, and I couldn't find it in his book. But this church, maybe through ESL classes or some other gestures of welcome and assistance, found success in connecting with this community, and some of them started coming to worship. But after a while, the congregation started getting anxious and uncomfortable because the longer these neighbors were there, they realized that they didn't have the same worship style and the same doctrines and church polity. And they started to want the church that was becoming theirs to reflect something of them rather than just coming to a church where they were given a friendly greeting, but the style and governance were foreign to them. And the congregation struggled and resisted. It turns out they were willing to welcome people who were different from them as long as they came on their terms. They were willing to welcome a different community so long as they were seen and not heard, so long as they stayed in their place and kept the church the same. We continue our series today, a series that includes messages that I consider some of the most important I will preach, and someone's excited about them too. You will be my witnesses, a vision for the church in the next quarter century. You will be my witnesses come straight from Acts 1:8, which sometimes is known as the Other Great Commission. The image that we're using is a picture of an ancient two-story watchtower in the middle of a vineyard, an image that will be especially relevant in some later topics. And in the sermons I will preach, John will be preaching one of them in the series, you will not hear me say much that I haven't said before, but I've never put it all together in one series for your consideration and discussion. And we're going to be posting clips of these messages online and making the full sermon recording and manuscripts easily available online because we want this to get you talking. We want this to get you excited. And the themes of this series fit loosely with the 6 core values, even though, as I told you last week, I pulled these themes and thoughts together independently of the core values with no original intention of making them fit. Last Sunday, in relation to the core value, Christ in our hearts, I shared that the church in these times must be stubbornly focused and centered on the life and teachings of Jesus. And I emphasized that we need this in the midst of many distortions of the Christian faith, as well as Christian nationalism that fuses and confuses our earthly nation state with the kingdom of God, which is for all people and all nations. And I relate today's topic to love in our behavior, that core value, as well as diverse in culture from our motto. You hear a lot about the decline of Christianity and church attendance, but every time we talk about that, we need to be careful to insert the words in the global north and west. Christianity is not declining everywhere. This graph shows that the growth of Christianity has been double the rate of the average world population growth on the continents of Africa and Asia. And this graph, although it's hard to see from where you are probably, from the Pew Research Center shows a future projection for the growth of Christianity in comparison to the general population growth that they expect up to the year 2050. And you see that sub-Saharan Africa is projected to continue to have the largest growth of Christianity. And if you look at the Asia-Pacific region, the third one down, the numbers are not as high, but it's the only region where the growth of Christianity is expected to outpace the general population growth. So we're in a situation where white Western Christianity has lost its dominance and influence, and it's other parts of the world that are growing and planting churches and discipling new believers and coming to us in the form of ethnic churches and missionaries. And if you ask me, God's Spirit is at work correcting for literally centuries of Christendom that was married to Western colonialism and domination. In the words of Isaiah, God is making a path in the wilderness and making the rough places plain. The people groups that Western Christian nations colonized are in the 21st century sending their people here. Their pastors, their teachers, their missionaries, their theological students, and they are bringing the word and the witness. I thought of Isaiah 56, which says, "Let no foreigner who is bound to the Lord say, the Lord will surely exclude me from his people. And let no eunuch complain, I am only a dry tree." And in our reading today, the image of God's global, colorful, diverse community is plain. The nations will stream to the mountain of the Lord. Peoples will come and say, "Come, let us go up to that mountain." Followed by the majestic vision of peace that is both here in Isaiah and in Micah. They will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore. Do you remember what Jesus said about the Spirit when he was talking to Nicodemus? The Spirit goes wherever it pleases. So we have a choice. Christianity is changing. The church with the capital C is becoming darker skinned and more colorful and has some different music and different languages and in many cases a lot more enthusiasm and vitality than the kind of church I grew up in. I saw some of this firsthand in my sabbatical in 2023. I attended a Karen congregation in Chicago. The Karen are a people group of Myanmar and Burma. I attended a Tamil worship service in Exton, Pennsylvania. They're from India. And both of those congregations are smaller than ours, but had more children and young families than we do. But not because they had flashy programs. They didn't have programs. They just know how to do life together Monday through Saturday. And togetherness is a part of their survival. And just like the early church didn't have programs or budget, and yet it grew like wildfire. And I'm not saying we don't need programs or budget. But the Bible says they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, to the breaking of bread, and to prayer. It says they ate together with glad and sincere hearts. That wasn't once a week. They knew each other. They knew their community. They were passionate about what they were doing. From the 75th anniversary survey to other meetings and discussions, we've heard a desire to see more young people and young families, a desire I obviously share. But here's a tough question, perhaps. How many young families outside the church do you know? Do you know all the young families inside the church? How many do you regularly interact with? I could tell in visiting these ethnic congregations that their worship gathering was just one small part of the life together they shared as believers. Most of the church that they did was outside the worship gathering I attended. Having been in full-time ministry for almost 20 years now, I still have a sneaking suspicion that the key to ministry with young families has more to do with what we do outside this building than inside it, and has more to do with how we live our lives on days like Monday or Tuesday than what programming we have on Sunday or Wednesday. But it's only a sneaking suspicion. So what are we to do? What is my vision for the church in the next quarter century as these things go? Well, we need to make sure we're on this train. God is doing something amazing in the global community, and the global community is right now here among us. You don't need a plane ticket. The church of today needs to open its doors to this movement of the Spirit and go beyond diversity to true inclusion. I mentioned Douglas Aviles Bernal earlier, and he wrote a book called Welcoming Community Diversity That Works. And we actually used this book for a book study here on Wednesday nights at some point before the pandemic. Here's one quote from his book that's a decent summary of the concept here. What I mean then by Christian diversity is a way of life that is far beyond toleration. It means life and community that welcomes and integrates differences as added riches that flow from God. He also points out that homogeneity is the norm, even when a church is ethnically diverse. And so I would say that the church of the next quarter century must embrace and welcome new expressions of church and changing demographics and find ways to fully include and integrate different people and expressions. One thing I like about Pastor Doug's book is that it devotes a lot of discussion to how difficult this is. He doesn't gloss over that. And it's illustrated by the opening story I shared. His book says something that I fear is all too true. When someone new comes, that person is welcomed in a way that says, "Welcome, do we have a job for you?" The sense of gladness at being wanted is dissipated by the feeling of being wanted just for what one brings, not who one is. Because you see, no one wants to be a token. No one wants to be a token person of color or a token young person or a token anything. And nobody wants to be a warm body in a pew. Aviles Bernal talks about how megachurches get praised for their diversity, but he makes the point that they are often too big for people to get to know each other and have their lives disrupted by one another. He references famed theologian Miroslav Volf, someone I probably should quote more, and what he says about life in solidarity. It's informed by the Spanish word, acompañamiento, meaning walking alongside. It means that one is exposed to the same things that the other person is experiencing and suffering as he or she suffers. And he suggests that until this happens, we have not reached inclusion. We know intellectually that there's a difference between unity and conformity, but despite that, I think so many of us still mistake conformity for unity. And similarly, I think we might know there's a difference between inclusion and toleration, but I think we are still all too often telling ourselves that we have included someone when we are in fact tolerating or accepting their presence. Whenever you, quote, include someone new in a social space, but the patterns, assumptions, and practices of your own life and that of the group go completely unchallenged or unchanged, inclusion has probably not happened. It also happens to be Christian Unity Sunday and the start of the week of prayer for Christian unity. And unity just sounds so nice, doesn't it? And if I don't understand what the word really means and what unity actually requires, I can sit down in my own church where everything feels comfortable and look over at a neighbor who might come from a totally different background and say to myself, wow, we're so unified. But are we? As Paul is saying to the Corinthians, Christian unity is not when the eye becomes a hand or when the foot becomes a head, but it's when we put into practice the principle that all of these different parts are interconnected and a part of the same body. And I want you to notice two notable things about Paul's famous passage here when he uses the metaphor of the human body. Number one, he deals with more than just one facet. He deals with both sides of this. In this passage, he deals both with the tendency to consider others not as good or worthy of inclusion. The eye cannot say to the hand, I don't need you. And he deals with our own tendency to see ourselves as not good enough. Now, if the foot should say, because I'm not a hand, I do not belong to the body, it would not for that reason stop being a part of the body, he says. And also, Paul wrote this 2,000 years ago when they had absolutely no scientific knowledge of how the body functions or how intricately connected it really is. They didn't know about the nervous system. They didn't know about the immune system. They didn't know why a stroke paralyzes you or that weakness can be caused by low hemoglobin in the blood. They didn't know any of that. And yet they knew by experience what we also know, that this thing is all interconnected. And you often don't realize how interconnected it is until you hurt one part. Some of you know this all too well. I mean, have you ever pulled a hamstring? Can't even sneeze when you pull a hamstring. My vision for the church is that we would go beyond diversity to a true, inclusive, and multicultural community where different expressions of Christianity are not just tolerated, but allowed to shape and change us. And where we do life together and encounter each other's families and neighborhoods and struggles in ways that shape and change us as individuals. Are there people in this church or in your life whom you avoid talking to because of a language or cultural barrier? I'm guilty. Why do we do that? Well, at best, it's because it requires more energy. It's stressful. It's uncomfortable. But consider this. That person may be fighting through far more stress and discomfort to be here in the first place than you and I are willing to experience in a moment or two. People like me avoid moments of discomfort while others live in discomfort day in and day out. Paul said that God has put the body together so that there should be no division in the body, so that its parts should have equal concern for each other. If one part suffers, every part suffers. If one part is honored, every part rejoices. And so, if we're not changed by our neighbor, we're probably not yet agape loving them. If we're unaffected by the pain of our neighbor, we're probably not yet including them. In Jesus' parable of the banquet, there were invited guests who couldn't be bothered. Sorry, I'm doing my own life over here. I will come to your table when it suits better. So the host has to have people go out and get the guests. Was it King James or one other translation? Out into the highways and byways. God is the host, and God doesn't do things on our terms. If the Western church doesn't want to come to the banquet, God won't waste his time. He'll go get others. Tomorrow's MLK Day, as Kathy talks about, and every year all of you should go back and read his letter from a Birmingham jail, among others. It's in this letter that he talks about how the white churches and pastors at the time nominally supported his cause, but they wanted it to be on their timeline, or they wanted justice and inclusion for black Americans to come about without upsetting their communities. But you see, not even Jesus could bring a good word or a good thing without upsetting communities. Have you noticed that? So, fortunately or unfortunately for us, we, in some cases, as I talk about this, it strikes me that we might look around and feel that we kind of have a low bar to clear right now. Hate and xenophobia and white supremacy have been given another wind and new public platforms. Sociologists point to the white backlash we've seen in this century so far and talk about how whenever a powerful majority starts to lose their power or majority, there's usually a time of resistance. And people are afraid of becoming minorities in settings where they have historically been the majority. But one brilliant commentator facetiously pointed out some irony. He said, "I'm always fascinated by the line, 'We don't want to become minorities in our own country.' Why not? Are they treated badly or something?" But low bar be as it may, we're not called to be good enough. We're not called to be satisfied with good enough in giving a vision for the church. We need to be truly strange, truly inclusive. All of this is the reason that church leadership has chosen to recognize heritage months like Black History and AAPI and Hispanic and more. Because we recognize that these communities have been historically marginalized and their stories and contributions not told and recognized. So the inclusion of God's kingdom is not reflected in a nominal diversity that simply allows minority communities into spaces that still assume whiteness and English and everything that as the norm. If we are in fact all equal image bearers of God, then we have to worship like it and read like it and sing like it. And make sure you know that this is not just about the diversity of race and ethnicity. This is also age and socioeconomic status and physical ability and neurodiversity. And when it comes to our Little C Church here at Calvary, I want to point out a few present and future projects, not to pat ourselves on the back, but to give you examples of small steps that we might try to take. I mean, you may have noticed as I talk about those other types of diversity that all videos shown in worship now use captions, whereas we were not careful to do that before. That helps not only the hearing impaired, but those whose first language is not English. And where we lack performers and artists from certain communities, we make use of recorded videos and music that reflect other languages and cultures. And we've also started brainstorming and budgeting for a project that many of you have not heard about yet, but I'm letting the cat out of the bag. A project that will convert one of our second floor classrooms into a private prayer room that doubles as a sensory space for individuals with neurological differences, or those with other psychological or emotional needs that can be served in this kind of calming space. Now, as happy as I am about such initiatives, big picture, such things don't necessarily constitute inclusion. It can just stop at accommodation if we let it. Here's how it all starts: approaching the other with curiosity and grace. That's how we learn to love. That's how we learn to value every part of the body. And it's this approach of curiosity and grace that I call on the church of today to use with another group of people that I would be remiss not to mention, the LGBTQ community. Now, you will probably be either relieved or disappointed to know that I'm not going to give full treatment to this issue today. After all, it's 11:30 and snowing again. But if we're talking about inclusion, I can't not touch this hot potato. I've probably gone too long without addressing it, and it's a hot potato that has burned down churches and denominations. I would only ask that you approach these individuals, also created in the image of God, with curiosity and grace. You know, it's interesting. Regardless of where any Christian or church lands on this, I think we've usually gone wrong when we argue and split churches and make litmus tests out of an issue that the Bible barely mentions and Jesus never mentioned. The handful of verses that do seem to mention it are found in contexts like Jewish purity laws and Greco-Roman sexual promiscuity, not loving, committed relationships. And whenever any relationship, I will tell you this, whenever any relationship, conventional or not, displays love and commitment and the fruits of the Spirit, all I know is that I'm on shaky ground to judge it. Curiosity and grace. Have you ever sat down with someone who is transgender and listened to their experience of gender dysphoria? I will be honest with you, gender dysphoria is one of the most baffling and confusing things I have ever known a human to experience. I do not understand it. I'm not necessarily on board with all the ways it's being addressed in our culture. I can't figure it out, but Jesus didn't ask me to figure out my neighbor. He asked me to love my neighbor. I need only ask myself, would I ever feel loved by someone who approached me with suspicion or condemnation about things about myself that I did not choose? LGBTQ persons are far more likely than the general population to experience harassment, bullying, and violence. They're far more likely to experience family rejection, employment discrimination, and homelessness. Did you know that according to surveys, 46%, nearly half of all young people with gender dysphoria or non-binary sexuality have considered suicide in the last year? I ask myself the Jesus question here just like I do always. How would Jesus have me approach a person who is not hurting anyone and feels like they belong and feels like they don't belong on this earth, much less the church? And quite frankly, one last thing, I'm a little tired of hearing about sexual harassment in bathrooms or the safety of women and girls because of the LGBTQ population. They're not the ones committing the sexual assault. I have a teenage daughter, and I'm way more worried for her safety when she's around straight men than the LGBTQ population. Curiosity and grace. If we have a word of judgment, let's save it for the people that Jesus saved it for. Jesus spoke words of judgment. Jesus spoke words of warning. Some of them are uncomfortable to read. There's almost a whole chapter in Matthew where Jesus goes through this litany of woes. Woe to you, woe to you. The question is, who did Jesus reserve this for? Answer, when Jesus talked like that, it was always to people who were abusing their power or using religion to oppress and condemn others. You and I might ask ourselves, what's the measure of this? How will I know when I've managed to fully include someone into my life? And I just want to say that maybe, just maybe, inclusion is not realized when I figure out how to include someone else in my space, but when I have had the vulnerability and the courage to be a welcome guest in someone else's space.